education migration. Thank you. And just to check that everybody knows that we are recording this session so that anybody who wants to can listen to it afterwards. If for any reason you want to raise an issue or a point and want the recording stopped temporarily, then please just indicate that. And Vikas is joining us now, so maybe we'll stick to our order of play. So welcome to this first panel of 2 on education, migration and development, exploring the Nexus. I'm going to be chairing this first panel, and Amy will pick up and explore and chair the second panel. So my name's Elaine Chase. I'm Professor in Education, Wellbeing and International Development at UCL's Institute of Education, or Faculty of Education. And it's a huge pleasure to welcome everybody here today to have a great discussion around in this first panel, the 4 papers that hopefully everybody's had a chance to watch and listen to and engage with in advance. If for any reason you haven't, they will be available after the session as well. So I'm going to introduce each of the speakers, first of all, who have about 4 minutes just to summarize their kind of core ideas and presentation, so that we can pick up and have a conversation about each of the presentations in due course. So welcome, Vikas. It's great that you've managed to access and join us. So I'm going to start with introducing you and the paper that you presented with Priya as well on the social and spatial mobilities towards planning education and beyond. So can I ask you, Vikas, to perhaps summarize the kind of key ideas that we've all engaged with in your presentation? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Elaine, and thank you, Amy, and thanks to everybody for having us. So please let me know if I'm not audible, but I'll just power through at the moment. The project itself, the work that Priya and I did was part of a larger project, which was actually housed at UCL. It was called the No Project, and it looked at the experiences of planning education in multiple global southern institutions and localities. In particular, for this presentation, what we'll focus on is also a thread that was key within the work package that we worked on, is the student and alumni trajectories in planning education. So we looked at 5 different institutions in 4 locations, and we had a set of conversations with students, learners, as well as alumni from these institutions. What we'd like to focus on today, essentially, is sort of a thread that emerged through our work, which was the understanding of tensions between positionality in space, in place, as well as the idea of aspiration that goes beyond place. So the tensions between place and locality in some senses, and the ways in which that has gone on to shape the views of our participants in relation to certain types of values that go on to add to knowledges of development and larger development paradigms in that sense. So broadly, that is where the study was situated. We were interested in those tensions. We looked at it in terms of gender, in terms of locations, in terms of language. Yeah, so I'll stop there. That's broadly sort of the conceptual idea of the paper, particularly, and where it's situated. And hopefully folks have had a chance to look at the presentation, and happy to take questions or conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vikas. And what we'll do, I think, is we'll run through all of the 4 summaries of the 4 presentations first. And then I'll kind of draw out some kind of key points that I think kind of cut across and connect them, and then we'll open up for discussion. But that's a really helpful summary. Thank you. So next, if we could go to Mariam. Thank you, Mariam. So Mariam is from the Lahore School of Economics, and the paper was exploring the relationship of vocational education and international migration to uncover critical aspects in ensuring workforce adaptability, relevance and contribution to international development. So over to you, Mariam. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you so much. This is my first time here in DSA conference, and I've recently completed my MPhil degree in development studies. Previously, I had done my MBA, so it was like a completely new world for me, this development world. And also to mention that I went back to college after a gap of 16 years. So I thought that, I myself was like a case study of, like reskilling and upskilling your own self. So because, like after 16 years, when I went back to college, it was like, where am I? So it was like, the whole world was online and I didn't even know how to use a PDF document. So, that's where I was. Because initially when I was in college 16 years back, like now 18 years back, so it was very different. So that made me think that, we keep on talking about long life learning opportunities, especially in developing countries. So like, what are the opportunities? Because I did face a lot of problems even getting back into the system to kind of upskill my education. And that's, where this whole idea came back. And, when I started looking, so the only thing that I could look into was vocational and technical education, because that was one thing that you could do at any point in time, even though when I got into more detail, it again posed a lot of challenges. So like the idea was to look into international employability and, the relevance of vocational education. And for that, with the help of my professor, my supervisor as well. So we took like data from World Bank for 86 countries, developing countries, which was, like lower middle, upper middle, but all developing countries. The data, because a lot of the countries didn't even have data on vocational education. So the countries that did have data, we took that and we kind of run some regressions to see whether there is a connection between. There was a lot of evidence for regular general education, but not vocational. So specifically looking into that data. So we did find that there was a positive relationship with vocational education and migration. And then to look into the case study, the context of Pakistan. So then I conducted like in-depth interviews of all relevant stakeholders, the internal stakeholders as well as the alumni who were working overseas, alumni that were working in the local market, to see the challenges that they were facing even after passing out, and how helpful was their certification to, like providing them that platform and that opportunity specifically at the overseas job market. So that's what the whole paper was kind of focused on, that, when because these were the people usually from the lower socioeconomic strata of the society. So if they're spending 3 years or 2 years or even 6 months of their time, so they're kind of giving up an economic opportunity. So is it really worth it for them? Like, do they get to earn more? Do they even get to be considered like, better than the unskilled labor? So that was like the whole idea behind kind of exploring this kind of nexus between, vocational education and migration. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mariam. That's really interesting, and really interesting how you positioned yourself within that kind of context and set of dilemmas as well. So that's great. Thank you. I'm going to move now to Anik Newman, who's based at the University Libre de Bruxelles and also University of Sussex. And your paper, Anik, on revisiting Eduscape through a post-colonial lens. Again, if you could give us a brief summary, that would be great.
So my paper was a bit more theoretical, but it was based on a year and a half of ethnography in the north of Senegal, which I undertook 10 years ago already, on educational decision-making of parents, but also aspirations and trajectories among youth. And in particular, how people chose between secular state schools and Islamic schools in the region. And Senegal has very high rates of outmigration. So next to Lesotho, it is the country in Africa with the highest proportion of its GDP coming from migrants, migrant remittances. And about half of Senegalese go to Europe or the US, but the other half go to other African countries or the Middle East. And I found that migration had an enormous influence on the educational landscape. In so many different ways. So, I mean, migrant remittances, paying school fees, but also funding in various ways, education provision, whether state schooling or Islamic schools, but also migration shaping youth's educational aspirations, and not in sort of simple or linear ways, but often in quite contradictory ways. And so I was looking for a theoretical framework to make sense of these multiple influences that migration had on the educational landscape. And I found the term eduscape, which has been coined in the early 2000s among scholars of comparative and international education. And it uses the framework of Arjun Appadurai, so anthropologist of globalization, who identified 5 what he calls scapes or types of flows that kind of help to explain globalization and its impact on local context. So his first scape is ethnoscapes, so that's flows of people or migration. Then there's technoscapes, which is flows of technology or commodities. There's financescapes, which is flows of money, capital, aid, also counts there, remittances, obviously. Then there's mediascapes, which is flows of images, narratives, or discourses through media, and increasingly today, social media or global popular culture. And then finally, there's ideascapes, which is concepts linked to Western constructions of modernity, like equality, democracy, freedom, emancipation, empowerment, and how these travel across contexts and policies based on these as well. And so I reviewed all the literature that I could find that used eduscape as a framework for analyzing the impacts of not just migration on educational landscapes, but globalization more broadly. And I found that, for my purposes at least, it was a really useful framework for making sense of the complexity that I had observed in northern Senegal, but with the caveat that the literature is quite Eurocentric. And there were 2 main ways that I found this to be the case. The first was that the way education is defined in eduscape is really based on the Western model of the school, which, although ubiquitous, is not the only form of education in the world. And so other knowledges, epistemologies, institutionalized learning systems are not really factored in to eduscape analyses and their relationship with kind of the formal Western style school. And obviously Islamic schools in the Senegalese context are a perfect example of a different kind of educational paradigm. And the second flaw that I saw in the eduscape literature was that when migration is studied, it tended to be focused on particular types of migration, in particular, the internationalization of higher education and the movement south to north of students going to university. And which, as Seb Rumsby, who will be presenting in the next panel, shows so brilliantly, is very quite small and privileged minority of people from the Global South. And this literature doesn't really consider what Saskia Sasten calls counter geographies of globalization, or people on the the rough end of what Seb Rumsby calls the 2-tier global migration regime. So my argument, my conclusion was that I still really like the eduscape concept for looking at these influences of migration and globalization more broadly on educational landscapes, but as long as we kind of decolonize the way this concept is used to factor in wider definitions of knowledges and epistemologies and education and learning, but also look at these sort of untold stories of migration and its relationship to education. But listening to all the presentations for this panel and the second one, there are so many stories being presented here. So that's fantastic.
That's great, Annie. Thank you. Really rich insights there. And I love the way you've connected across the panels as well. So thank you so much for doing that. Again, I think a lot that we can pick up and discuss there. But before we do that, I'm going to hand over to Shalini then from the International Institute for Population Sciences in Mumbai. And your paper is on the effect of short-term seasonal migration has on long-term educational achievements and future development prospects of children from some of the poorest households in India, and the cyclical nature of the 3 variables, which you go on to discuss in your paper. So over to you, Shalini. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Elaine, for introducing me. Before I begin, I'd like to tell you that I'll be joining PhD from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai, and on the same topic. So your views and ideas are welcome and encouraged. So before going into the details, I'll just sum up a few because I have been told that my title is a bit too long. There are 4 points. That is mainly we'll focus on seasonal migration, also known as temporary migration. We'll also focus on educational achievement and continuation of education for children. And we'll also focus on poverty-induced distressed seasonal migration and how COVID affects all of them, right? So seasonal migration is actually has been quite prevalent traditionally in India, and it was basically the males from agricultural household who would migrate to the or from rural to urban areas to supplement their income during the dry seasons, the seasons where they could not cultivate, right? So that was already there, but due to some economic pressures and due to COVID-induced lockdowns for the past 2 years, where they could not migrate and supplement their household income, this has now transformed into distressed seasonal migration. Now, what happens is, as I have discussed, two things happen. That is, one, because the session of school in the government schools and usually all over India, it interacts directly with the seasonal migration session, right? If you can see my video, you'll see that about the children who migrate with their parents as a household miss 6 months of schooling in total, right? So because they're migrating from their villages to the place of work, that can be stone quarries in the cities or in construction sites, sugarcane cutting areas, etc. So usually after they come back, because they have missed so much of school, and they usually end up getting a year loss, like they fail, and eventually they just drop out of school. So the people that I interviewed at site, most of the males, adult males, had parents who were themselves seasonal migrants, and the highest level of education was till class 9, right? So what happens is, because they as children did not get proper education, they could not get proper jobs, so they also became laborers, seasonal laborers, right? So their children, they also migrated with their children, and it kind of shows that it will kind of happen again and again if it is not stopped. So that's why it's important. And because right now, because of COVID, many of the parents, the migrants that I have spoken to, have said that because they did not have any income for the last 2 years, most of who were landless laborers. That's why the poorest household. So they could not migrate for employment, and they had taken huge amount of loans from their local brokers, who also was going to take a percentage of their lump sum income, because the brokers had provided them with information and transport to the sites. So because of economic push effect, they migrate with their families, so that there are more hands to work and they can increase their income, and then that results in no continuation education for the children, and as a result, again, the cycle continues. So that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Shalini. That's a really helpful summary, and thank you everybody for being really succinct and really helpful summaries across the papers. That's great. I mean, just a few things that struck me. Amy and I have been kind of exploring this Nexus for a while now. We're developing a kind of program of teaching and learning at UCL as well, and have coming out an edited volume, which some of our authors of contributors are here today, which is wonderful. But I think what it's bringing out, the additional kind of inputs and ideas, is just how vast this kind of Nexus is, and the multiple different foci and lenses that we can bring to it. So I think it's an ongoing and an enriching process, which is fantastic. And hopefully after today, we can continue the conversations around this. But from the papers in this first panel, I think what comes out really well are the different education types and settings that we're kind of exploring. So higher education in the case of sort of the case study of urban planning in Vikas and Priyas's work, this kind of trade-off for of kind of tension and questions for higher education in the context of Anik's work between state versus Islamic higher education. Then we've got the technical and vocational education training component, and then the access to primary and secondary education in Shalini's work in context of migration, which I think is really, really important. You've drawn on different theories, Anik and Vikas and Priya, you've kind of been drawn towards Padurai's work and scapes and eduscapes, and the importance of critiquing these as well, Anik, you know, the idea of taking this post-colonial lens to eduscapes, which I think is really enriching and important. Miriam, you've drawn on human capital theory and endogenous growth theory model to explain and provide explanatory value to some of the work that you've been doing. The different methodologies are also really rich. Again, Miriam, you've drawn on a combination of quantitative you know, panel data over a long period of time to look at the provision of technical education alongside qualitative work. We've got examples of ethnographic work and other qualitative insights as well. The different disciplines that people are coming from: population studies, economics, anthropology, migration studies, education, demography, all of them providing really kind of rich and combining lenses. And what I really liked is how all of the papers offer really rich insights into the intersections between class, caste, location, and gender, and how global and national as well as regional inequalities play out in complex ways in context of migration and education. So I think it's just a really enriching sort of set of papers and ideas. It'd be great now to go on and think about questions from to our panelists. I have a few questions which I can throw in, but I'm going to open it out first of all. If people have a question, if they can, I think simply given our number, we're a nice, neat number, if we could just raise their hands or either raise your hand or use the reaction functions to raise your hand. So questions to any of the panelists on their work would be great. Anik, you look like you're wanting to come in, is that right?
I can't find the hand. I can't find the little yellow hand, so I'll show my little pink hand. Yeah, just to say that I really appreciated all the presentations, and yeah, it's really interesting to have like really different perspectives to sort of what I work on. And I had a question for Shalini. I found, yeah, this context of the seasonal migrants really interesting, because there's so many connections I made with sort of things that I've read about, like nomadic pastoralism in the African context, particularly as a result of climate change, making rural and pastoralist livelihoods even more precarious and vulnerable, and the kinds of solutions that are sort of being proposed to that. And I sort of felt, you know, sort of quite sad that the same sort of problems are coming up in the African context with the pastoralists, that to what extent can these sort of educational mitigation programs really address the root causes? And you say this towards the end of your video, that, you know, there needs to be more connections with, you know, other government departments, and in particular sort of, you know, rural livelihoods. And I just wondered if there are any sort of initiatives like that sort of underway, because, you know, the main problem is sort of this huge structural inequalities and the precarity of this group of people, you know, the landless laborers and the brokers and their caste position and so on. And without resolving those questions, it seems like, you know, putting a plaster on a on a huge wound. So I wondered, you know, what if there are any initiatives like that that are underway, or, you know, if you would have recommendations for such kind of policies.
Yeah, and just to add, Shalini, I had a similar question, because you touch on these experimental efforts that are happening for children in these different settings, and I wondered whether there had been any evaluation of those at all, or whether there are any hints of what might be constituting good practice. Because I think the relevance of this, as Anik is saying, goes way beyond the context that you've been working in, and is really important. Yeah, thanks.
Should I answer right now, or should I
Yes,
wait?
yes, that would be great.
Okay, so I'll start with Aniki first. So thank you for your question. It does, like, I'll start with the last question you asked from caste perspective, right? So caste in India, what happens is right now the economic, I think everything is related to money right now, right? Who has the more resources, who doesn't have. So what plays out in the villages is those with traditionally, and it's similar everywhere, those who already have generational wealth, they know how to use that against other people to accumulate more, right? So what happens is, because they have money with them, they can lend it out to the people, like landless laborers, who are traditionally have not been able to accumulate that much amount of money and resources because of their caste. And because many times what happened is, they would be taken away by the more wealthy, right? So the government of India and many state governments, what they're doing is they are drawing on the economic perspective and the distribution of wealth among the villages to solve this issue. So caste is basically more ingrained within the religion. So now religion is like, even if you're not that religious, I think if you have a position of power, you will never let that go, right? So only people who are only who are in the position of power have the most like the more capabilities of making changes. So that kind of becomes like a situation where, of course, I won't want to lose my power. So what the government is doing is they're drawing on the economic perspectives, where there are several, for the adults, there are several village level banks where people, not only the farmers, but the laborers can take money, like instead of the money lenders, but with like 1% or less interest from the government, right? So that helps them, although that has not reached everywhere, but that has been a lot of help. Then again, there are certain small scale, the next question, there are several small scale experiments and policies which were like which have been kind of successful for some amount of time in states like Jalna in Maharashtra, district of Jalna in Maharashtra, where sugarcane farming and stone quarrying is like a big economic giant there. People from Orissa, other parts of Maharashtra migrate to Jalna to work. And in Dang, what happens is people migrate from Dang to other places. So you'll find entire villages left empty and locked because everyone has gone to work, right? So what they have done is the government, in collaboration with ILO and several other institutes, what they have done is they have set up residential schools for children, so that even when the parents migrate to the like places or sites of work, seasonal work, they don't have to go with them, right? This was like, I wouldn't say hugely successful, but successful to a great extent, because the older kids like 10 and above would stay back, right? But the problem again happened with younger kids. Now no one wants to separate younger children from their parents, right? So they were taken with them, and in the sites it's not really healthy and safe for those children to live, and so they were already affected. Now again, because why I like mentioned intergovernmental collaboration is because there was a really successful experiment, I would say right now, experiment or a project in Jalna in collaboration with the state government of Maharashtra and ILO. It ran for about 10 years, but it then shut down. It was shut down because of intergovernmental and the like inter-institutional, they couldn't collaborate well for a long time. So that needs to be done. There have been several other like schemes like education guarantee scheme, which Tata Trust is helping a lot. What they do is they provide education guarantee card, and like they'll track attendance and lessons for each kid, each child, and they would upload it on the cloud, and Tata Trust handles that. And when they have migrated to a different location, there'll be government schools near the site, and they'll have that card where the teachers can access how much that child has learned, in what language that child has learned, right? And which class that child is in. So that kind of helps a lot. That also has a few drawbacks, because like in the villages, many people could not it's not well maintained, you could say. So there are a few things to work out, but there are several policies underway. The only thing which I would want my government to do is to make it a not a regional thing, and make it accessible all over India, because seasonal migration actually is active everywhere, not just some parts. So that will help a lot.
Thanks, Shalini. That's really, really helpful. I'm just reading the chat. A question from Seb. I have a question, if there's time, for Anik. In your video, you talked about the experience of rereading your field notes and discovering the centrality of migration, which you did not write about in your PhD. Do you feel that it undermined your previous research analysis in any way? Not trying to be critical, just curious.
I just wanted to, I saw, Mariam, that you had your hand up at one point.
Oh, sorry.
So, but it's
Yes,
gone now.
I did actually, because I just like Shalini as a paper, I was just wondering that, you've talked about the poorest households, in your presentation. So like, how do we really kind of differentiate whether, students who are these kids who are dropping out from school, is it purely because of migration, or is it just simple poverty? Because I don't know if schools in India are absolutely free, because if I compare it to Pakistan, the poorest households, especially in rural areas, they don't really value education, because they feel, okay, might as well come with me to the field, or like you mentioned, extra hands at work. So is it just because you feel migration is like a dominant reason, or is it just plain old poverty that, they're like, okay, we don't really, and how do we kind of differentiate between the two, that what is the more dominant reason? That's what was coming to my mind when I was just kind of going through it. And when Anik, when you were talking about, these biases about, these 5 education landscapes. So you talked about, they're not considering the religious institutions kind of a thing. So I was just I just wanted to just curious that, how were they supposed to, what do you think could be a way to include those? Could it be coming into the customs, a part of it, what is the norms in that particular area? Or they're not really kind of analyzing those religious institutions using those 5 scales. So that's what I wanted some clarification on. Thank you so much.
Great. And in the interest of time, Shalini, is it okay if I move to Anik to respond to the questions first? And just so that everybody gets an opportunity, that's great. But it's a really important question about the role of poverty in these decision making there. Anik, over to you.
Okay. Seb's question, I would say any data collection, any analysis is inevitably partial, right? It's impossible to cover everything. So, my PhD was good for what it did, which was very much focused on secular and Islamic education and all these debates about faith-based schooling and the relative value and utility, and comparing secular bias among development actors who tend to underestimate the value of religious education. So it did that well. And I like to think that my later work that takes more of a migration lens complements the first analysis. But I just think we can keep analyzing our work for years and find new things as new paradigms. You know, I've just only started working with decolonial theory, and that's just opened a whole new a sort of set of questions that I can ask of myself and the things that I've been using. So, you know, yes, the question, yeah, about how can we consider these other forms of education or migration in the EduScape, in analyses using an EduScape framework. In the chapter that I wrote on which this presentation is based, but I kind of also say it in the video, I think there's a real strength in ethnographic research, because the idea is to go in without necessarily very strictly predefined questions, and to really just let people speak and, you know, observe things on the ground, and to take, you know, really rigorous field notes on everything that you observe, all the conversations that you have. And then that allows for things to emerge from the field site reality that, you know, we as researchers might not necessarily have considered important. And I think that's a useful way, you know, that these kinds of issues can then come out. Because I didn't actually, I mean, this is another sort of anecdote, I didn't actually set out to study Islamic education in Senegal. I was originally gonna, you know, I was very much informed by these sort of development paradigms, and I was initially interested in girls' education and girls' schooling and all the discourses around the importance of education for empowering girls. And then it was when I went to Senegal and just happened to visit a village through a contact of a contact, and they were really into Islamic education, and all the boys were going to Quranic schools rather than state secular schools, but all the girls were going to secular schools because actually it was considered a less valuable kind of education. And that's when I thought, wow, this is a real issue that I should, that, you know, it's a story that just hasn't been told. So I think ethnographic research really helps us to sort of uncover these sort of untold stories.
Thanks very much, Annie. That's great. I'm really conscious of time. I'm wondering whether I could just ask if there are no other pressing questions. Have I missed anyone's hand? I wanted to ask Vikas about, you know, really, really interesting paper around the kind of planning education. But just briefly, again, we're always short of time, but what do you think some of the implications of these insights are for planning education, and I guess for other aspects of higher education more broadly, from your work?
Could I just like add something to, you know, Vikas's question? Sorry.
Yes,
you know, you talk about like three things, like the gender, to which was like, you know, the two of those things were like more of like social issues, of course, you know, we face in developing countries, the discrimination that we face. But one thing that you talked was like the location. So I was just wondering that when we're talking about location, so wouldn't that increase kind of like the tensions between, you know, like if I'm feeling that, okay, like in my area, you know, the educational institutes are not as good as the other ones, or, you know, they're not giving me the best of opportunities. So wouldn't that kind of raise more resentment towards other places, or wouldn't it kind of like promote more migration towards, you know, more urban centers? So how do you think that could all be included in the planning part of it? Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Miriam. Thanks, Elaine. So I'll try and sort of quickly get to what I imagine might be a sort of a decent way to try and respond to these. One is on the implications of planning education, right? So just to sort of build on what Anik has also been saying, in terms of the idea of these scapes leading to a certain type of imagination of those spaces and locations, right? So that is what Apatare is essential sort of way of thinking about media and media culture and all of those, right? So there is a discursive sort of creation of those localities and places. And so the way in which I imagine one on the implications of planning education is essentially to be agile and flexible enough to understand what development means in localized context, simply because of those kind of, you know, tension-filled interstices within which these meanings are made. Right, so a person moving from a rural area into a big city to learn planning education has a very different way of understanding issues that the curriculum of planning education may not have. And it is that tension, I think, we are, this work may be able to speak to a little bit more clearly, and it happens in different sort of ways, right? So those are the ways, and this is moving sort of a little bit into Miriam's question a bit. We found that they pivot off of things like gender and pivot off of language, and they pivot off of it. So, and particularly gender in terms of intersectionalities, right? So we have one of the key conversations that we had to do with this young Dalit women scholar who came from law and sort of got into this space of planning and planning education, urban studies. And her imagination of that trajectory is essentially of finding a position in a capitalist society more than it is about development. It is about finding, you know what I mean? Like, it is more about, it is the instrumental nature of education that allows for a certain type of empowerment. And it moves her beyond her positionality, it moves her beyond her rural sort of identity, it moves her in, so it is a very strategic way in which that is sort of harnessed for in all of these trajectories. And I think it would be important for us to then, I don't know if there's a question of resentment as much as it is a strategic sort of fight against or talking back to certain types of structures. And so that is where the idea of opportunity emerges. And that is where I think planning education particularly, and I'm using planning education and simply because that is the context within which the study was conducted, but it is universal in that sense. I mean, you can imagine the same kind of trajectories, challenges, and you know, speaking back to structures, even within STEM education, and even within any other kind of education that has predominance within our sort of understanding of what good education is. I mean, if you're not a lawyer or you're not an engineer, you've wasted your higher education study. So, I mean, it is within those paradigms that I think it sort of allows us to, you know, pivot ourselves into this.
Actually,
Wonderful.
if I could
Thanks
just
so
add
much,
to
because,
that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Priya, but we have to,
Sure.
I really hope a lot of these ideas and themes will come up in our second panel, but unfortunately we need to leave this space and go into the next one. So please hold on to that question. Thank you so much for all the insights and input. And I feel sure that a lot of the ideas that have been raised are going to kind of carry on through in the second panel, which Amy will be sharing in the place. But you need to leave this slot now and go into the other panel, which is a separate link.
We have to go out and go back in.
Go back into the other panel. But thank you so much, everybody. This is really, really enriching and really interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and hopefully see you again in 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Right. So I guess we just have to do the same.
We have to stop the recording.
Yeah, I can do that.
Oh, I can.